welcome back, everybody. I'm glad to see that at least some of you have decided that it's worth investing more time into this interesting afternoon. Today, we're looking at the scientific backbone of storytelling. And I'm happy to introduce you to a series of guests here in the front row, many of whom are graduates from our university. Unbelievable. And they have remained friends with Gabriele since when they did languages in our faculty. So it's so nice. I started getting these emails saying, can I come to the lesson? Can I come? I thought, wow, you're really famous.
And I added, pochi ma buoni. It's like wine, if you drink long, you get really...
Okay, and anyway. Today we have managed to press the record button. So if any of your colleagues, all right, didn't manage to come this afternoon, you can tell them that the recording will be available. Okay? Gabriele, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Thank you very much for coming here today. Now, I'm going to just read one thing from here. So, scientific and popular are sometimes seen as different ways of writing. So, and then you've got science, and you've got this obsession with a certain type of writing. You have to be careful what you write, as an author. And then you got the popular writing, so to speak, divulgazione in Italiano, so which is more or less everything and nothing at the same time. So, but what we're going to see today is that they're not really very different, these two. Okay, can you hear me from over there? Yeah, all of you. Okay. So, is it still possible to combine both things? And we see how this can be achieved today. So, of course, this you can say, well, it's normal, factual correctness, it's all for us, everything, But these days, as you know, people access information online and they think if it's online, it's real. But being real is one thing, being factual is something different. I told you yesterday the example I gave you about the pronouns, you remember? The vous and usted, and I was confused, and I asked the computer, AI, to say, what's the equivalent of lei in Spanish and French, and it gave me usted in French and vous in Spanish. So if you are, obviously that's a simple example, but how do you know that the information you get is factual, is factually correct? And that's exactly what it gets when it gets very, very difficult, when you have to write. Because on the one hand, you've got a deadline, I suppose, for a publisher, or say for a radio broadcaster. And on the other hand, you've got to actually think about what you're going to write, and then what you write has to be precise and factually correct. But as we saw yesterday with the example from Io Donna, some people just write a lot of nonsense and get away with murder. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid here. So if the information is found in many sources, it does not mean that it's reliable. So let's have a look at some, the newspaper you may be familiar with, Guardian, everybody says, oh, the Guardian, everything is precise and everything. All newspapers contain factual errors, some more than others. So rather than say, if it's in the newspaper, a famous newspaper, it must be correct. Vogue, are you familiar with Vogue? As you can see, I'm not, I don't care about fashion, as you can say, but, I ended up reading something in Vogue. And then I took Wikipedia, not my favorite friend, because Wikipedia, as you know, writes everything and the opposite of everything. If you are a specialist in a certain area, Wikipedia is a bit of a dodgy kind of tool. If you're ignorant completely about a topic, for example, you're looking for physics and you know nothing about physics, well, Wikipedia is a fantastic tool. Until you meet somebody who knows about physics and you start scratching your head. But let's have a look at the examples here. What I'm asking you to do is, can anybody in the audience try and explain what is factually wrong with these? Okay, let me show you the text. I just need to get into it. Let me just move down a little bit, because with my glasses I struggle to read anything. Okay, so can you read it from here? Can you see this text? Can you read it or not?
Yeah, yes, can you all see? Read it.
Yeah, have a look. Can you just catch together? Well, can you have a look at that paragraph and see whether that content, well, in your opinion, is actually correct? Can you spot the problem? You need to answer now. I'm going to show you the next one. You ready for the next one? Or are you still reading it?
Still reading.
I'm sorry. Just this, just that. In fact, I can actually shorten that, but I don't want to give you way too much information. Okay, it's only here. Can I move on? Okay, so next is, sorry, I need to go back to this. Vogue. It works. Oh dear. Oh. Okay, so here we go again. Can you see it? Is it right? I can try to make it slightly bigger. Is it much better like this? Sorry about that. Yeah, are you happy with this? And then we move on to the final one, which is Wikipedia. I just need to scroll down a little bit. Okay, so here it's even more confusing. Okay, which is why Wikipedia, I keep saying Wikipedia is a very poor tool. Have you spotted the inconsistencies at all? Have you noticed them? Okay, can you just speak to your partners just to discuss what you think is wrong?
I think this one is the best. No, it's actually was clear because it says she graduated with a degree in political science and then started a PhD. While the other ones tells us that she studied for a degree. She studied for a PhD or did she study for a bachelor? Two different things.
And have a PhD.
I can hear you very well. Somebody's saying something quite interesting, yeah, but I mean, most of you may have actually understood where the problem is. I heard a muffled voice, but I think you got it. Yeah? Do you agree with one another, or do you need more time? Or should I give it the answer? Or would you like to give it a go? Would you like to give it a go? Anybody? The lady there, glasses? Yep, yep.
Me?
Yep. Yeah, I heard you, that's why.
Oh, that's why. The first thing that got my eye in the first part was that they were focusing a lot on the PhD aspect, that she got a PhD in political science, which usually political science is a bachelor here in Italy, but then we go to Wikipedia and they say that she graduated with a degree in political science and then obtained after getting the degree and after studying acting, she gets a PhD in political science and education. The part about education says University of Milan, BA, PhD. So they didn't. The other articles did not specify that she had a whole career of graduating in bachelor and PhD in the same thing. So they all just put political science, and that's all.
Pretty close to that. Anybody else who wants to add to this?
I think it's a bit confusing, the timeline of the storytelling in the Vogue or the other one, I don't remember. It says that she started the PhD and then she changed her mind and her path by doing the meme. And then on Wikipedia, it's written that she finished the PhD after having done the meme. So it's a bit confusing, the timeline.
Yeah. Anybody else who want to contribute to this debate? Don't be shy. Don't worry. It's interesting, but well spotted. It's exactly. This is actually much worse than this. It gets. Look at this. Look, this is actually not very professional. Without working too hard, she studied for a PhD. Now, anybody who's done a PhD can tell you it can destroy your life. So that's the first element. And he says either there's a problem with the university, which she got her degree, and it means that it's not very good for that university. So it could be very bad for the image of this university in Milan. So, but the reality is a bit more straightforward. It's that the second one. So the PhD didn't exist in Italy until 1980. So that's when information is not correct. So it'd been easier to actually, focus on one thing. It wasn't possible for her to obtain it here. She would have, done it elsewhere. And the fact that the information is very confusing says it's all about how factual writing should be about. You need to be careful with what you write. Especially, you saw The Guardian was the worst of the two offenders in Vogue. Vogue, nobody's expecting Vogue to be, an academic kind of publication. The Guardian used to be slightly more serious. But Wikipedia, they think they know it all. They add a lot of information, a lot of waffle. And that's exactly what you need to avoid, waffle. Have you ever seen that thing in Wikipedia? You don't understand very much in Wikipedia, do you? Why? Because often people who write Wikipedia, not always, are non-specialists. So they add information because they want to appear on Wikipedia. I had to be blunt here, okay? So sometimes you need to say, look, if you don't know anything about it, don't write. And we get to this in a minute. Well done, though. Fantastic. So that's an example here. But, okay, I'm not here to actually preach, In fact, I wrote this. Remember that we're all ignorant here. And therefore, you have to choose when you write carefully. And the example I gave you earlier on is everybody's ignorant. Everybody, I include myself. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, ignorance is the reason why I write. I'm ignorant, I'm curious, and therefore I want to learn something for myself. And then I like to share it with other people like a baby. I know some people think this is very childish, but that's exactly what I do. I've got the enthusiasm of a child, if you want, which perhaps sometimes people see as not very nice. They may not appreciate that thing. But if you're curious, then writing is for you, okay? Because you can start doing a lot of research, have fun, so it's not boring. It's not dry like some research you do for university, which can become very, very, very boring. Now, the other side, though, of the coin is that if you're ignorant, you're forced to check you understand the meaning of every word you use. And I mean it, every word. Because when you speak, you see, there is an interesting thing. There's an interesting book, if you're interested in writing this. It's called The Language Game by three colleagues. One is called Nick Chater. He's at Warwick University. The other is Morten Christiansen, who teaches at Cornell in the United States. And then there is a third guy coming to Nottingham in the summer, in the autumn, is Ben Ambridge. And they will write about language acquisition from children, and they do a lot of experiments. They experiment on chimps as well. What I'm trying to say is that when we look at words, often we assume that we grasp every single aspect of the meaning of a word. But that's not the way it works, I'm afraid. So imagine when you go home, when you talk about the lounge or the drawing room, the sitting room, have you had an argument with people sitting next to you? What do you call that? What would you call that? Have you been in this situation before? Yeah? So the language game is about that a little bit, in the sense the language is not always fixed meaning in your brain. But the other thing is you've got tools to help you, fill the lacuna. Because we have a lacuna. We only have a limited understanding of the words we use. What has it got to do with writing? Well, we saw it yesterday, that people throw in every word, like chiaramente, clearly, and the person hadn't got a clue what clearly meant, because he was very clear. He was not clear at all. In fact, he just wrote a lot of nonsense. Okay, so even adverbs, sometimes you start thinking of using an adverb and think carefully. Look up the dictionary. Have a look at all the meanings of that word before you choose it. Okay, so that's I know it actually sounds like being too precise, but precision is useful. You will see why in a minute. So, how do you do this? Well, now the temptation is to use this tool. I mean, it's like a fool, because how are you going to check that information is actually correct? Because as you know, AI can give you any kind of answers, including usted is French and vous is Spanish. And if you haven't got a clue about Spanish or French, you think, oh, that's great, that's brilliant. Imagine doing that work. Could be embarrassing. So, for example, what sort of dictionaries? Well, you've got the advantage here that you have access to the possibly, arguably, the greatest dictionary of all, the Oxford English Dictionary, which is an amazing source. Okay, we'll see that in a minute. Okay, it gives you not just the meaning of the word, but it gives you, not in a prescriptive way, okay, the descriptive way, but it also gives you the meaning of a word as it is recorded through the centuries, from the first recording to the most recent recording. And that gives you an idea how words develop as well. Okay, and that's essential when you're doing this kind of research, when you're writing also to inform people. Okay, because if you do things hastily, and I saw something today, which was actually crazy, and I thought, completely missed the point. Somebody published something about food today, and he wrote complete nonsense. I haven't written to this person yet, but why? Because the person hasn't checked information before publishing it. Okay, I had to tell him politely today to change it. So, Duden, imagine the Grande Dizionario della Lingua Italiana, GTLI. It's a bit outdated, but it's a very difficult dictionary to use because it's not organized. It's PDF, so it's a bit of a pain in the backside when you have to use it. It's not easy, user-friendly. The Zingarelli, Petrarcani is a bit more difficult to use, but still useful. And I'm sure you've got more resources, other languages, French, you name it, and Spanish. But the OED is more than a dictionary. Historical dictionaries are, for me, the most important tool. I wouldn't be able to write anything without them, even if I don't write about the English-speaking world, by the way. So this is exactly what is interesting about this. And you can access it through the university, or if you work in business, I'm not starting selling anything, by the way, but for €100 a year, you have access to the OED. And believe me, if you have to become a broadcaster or a professional writer, whatever you're going to do, storytelling, that's an investment. That's not wasting money, okay? Because without the OED, you wouldn't have access to anything else. So I'm going to show you in a minute what I mean, okay? For example, bibliographical details. So you're going to go to the source, the original source, and now you can find these books, the original books, without wasting time. You can read the main book and you will find some more information. So, for example, I was accessing a 1653 book written by a woman. It was a cookery book. But we don't really know whether a woman wrote it. We supposed it was a woman because they were the right initials. As you know, those days, just after the civil wars, it wasn't easy to publish anything. And so this person died, and then after a couple of years, she died in 1651, this book was published. And it's interesting because it was written by a woman, certainly, and it's interesting because there are some interesting information about how recipes worked. For example, for the first time, not just for the first time, you see there are details about how long you should cook certain items for, which is not always the case in previous books. So what has it got to do with storytelling? You absorb a lot of information from this, and then you start telling your story. But if you're not informed by the original source, how can you tell a story if you're relying on somebody else's resources? Are you with me? So go to the original resource because you can, it's like mind-boggling. It's like a child, and you open a bag of chocolates, and all of a sudden you say, wow. That's exactly the emotion I feel when I feel, because you see the original editions, for example. So you see how people wrote in those days. You notice that the punctuation is very different. We're going to get to that in a minute as well. So it's absolutely a journey in time, and it's absolutely fabulous. I'm not trying to sell anything, by the way, but you will love it. Yeah, perhaps I'll give you some details if you want. You can write to me. So, and it's, as I said, reading these books. So through the OED, you go to the original sources, you just find a lot of databases. You can go to the original books these days and read them, and then you can write. And believe it or not, a lot of these books have not been explored a lot, because some people say, oh yes, cookery, who cares about this? And believe it or not, you find a lot of interesting stories. And you can contribute to updating the dictionaries, as I did last year, 2 years ago, okay, about Prosecco. So, but before we get to that in a minute, let's move on to something slightly different here. We'll go back to the words in a minute. Sorry. Okay. Oh, sorry. I got it. Source reliability. Now, this is a tricky one because somebody asked me yesterday, but who was it? The person who asked me. Is the person still here? It wasn't Laura. Can you repeat the question, so if you remind us of that problem?
I was wondering, especially in a topic in which we're completely ignorant and we don't know where to start, from which sources should we draw our information, and how can we discern which is a good source, which one is a good source?
Exactly, and I said the OED is certainly one of the best sources of all because it's absolutely massive. Okay, and then from that you go to find the original. You got the bibliographical details, and then you can find a lot of databases where you've got a database of X, Y, Z, whatever. I think there are plenty of things you can find online. I don't remember another one about old English books, and unfortunately, I'll try to pass it on to Professor Murphy when I can find my memory back, because I cannot remember anything at the moment. Anyway, but it can take ages to find reliable sources, and I'll give you an example now. Really scholarly work. Next month, I'm going to publish an article about coffee houses. And you think, okay, coffee in England. Okay, that's interesting. Where do you start? This is the question. Well, you start with the OD. You look up coffee house, and you start looking through the sources. You look through the books. Have a look if something interesting, depending whether you want to write in the 17th century, 18th century. If you go to scholarly work about that, you can go and use Google Scholar, for example, as opposed to Google Books, which sometimes gives you some wrong information. More on that in a minute. Google Scholar is useful because some articles are boring. We all agree. I also write boringly sometimes, not exciting stuff. But the advantage of this is that you need to remember that in order to get your articles or books published, there's a very thorough process, or usually there is a very thorough process, peer review, you name it. Okay, so one thing is to publish an article in Corriere della Sera when you talk about Harry Potter and Virginia Woolf. But if you wrote that in a journal, you will get published. I think we will laugh at you. Okay, so you have to be careful here. So, why are academics better? I don't think academics are better, but because as an academic, you go through thorough training. Whereas if you just write in general, you just write, but your approach perhaps is not always informed by a critical view of the topic you're dealing with. Okay, there are a lot of issues here. Okay, so scholars tend, I'm not saying this is always the case, I have to be careful not to generalize here, but they tend to question the truthfulness of the information they analyze. Now, this is another problem. And even when I did my PhD as an ethnographer, one thing I never did is to talk about me. In fact, the only time I did it, I remember one of my supervisors said, "This is not about you, Gabriele, this is about the content." And that was the only time I was told off. Okay. So when you learn to behave like this, you don't think, "Oh, I want to show off, I want to impress, but I want to tell the truth," or what I think, in my opinion, what it should be interesting to say about what I believe is the truth. Okay. So, important thing. Try and avoid writing about topics you are emotionally attached to. I'm not saying you shouldn't write about your family, but this is exactly where it gets very dodgy. Okay, so your place of birth, city of origin, family. Why? Because if you get emotionally involved, and you will see later on when Nikki speaker is in a minute, if you get emotionally involved, you lose the ability to focus on your subject. Imagine you get into a conversation, it becomes an argument, and people attack you because you come from X city, so from Rome instead of Naples, and the conversation becomes animated. Imagine doing that in writing. Can you be objective or not? It's a question. Can you become objective there? No. Yeah? No. So the best thing to do is detach, try not to get into topics that are too personal. Okay? You can be biased by personal relationships. So you have to be careful here. Bias distorts perceptions. Okay. Imagine this is the most common one. You write about food and you think, gosh, my grandmother used to be a fantastic cook and she invented this thing called la ricetta della nonna. Okay, spaghetti della nonna. And you find out that spaghetti della nonna didn't exist until, you know, don't know, 1925. And your great grandmother, you know, never actually cooked that stuff. What is going to happen to you? Have you ever seen online people arguing about food? They say this is exactly, you know, this is being made by, you know, by storytelling in companies. Michele can tell me a story or two. I think people write on labels, we've been making this for hundreds of years, and you only find out that that product only is being basically made for, you know, it didn't exist until 1925 or whatever the date. Yeah, are you with me on this? Okay, imagine pizzoccheri. Have you heard of pizzoccheri from the VAT line? Okay, well, pizzoccheri apparently didn't exist until the 18th century. So to say the pizzoccheri been there for 1,000 years, as some people write, it's nonsense. So why do you do that? Because you start thinking about your identity. And identity is a very bad tool when you write. Okay, so stay away from that, in my opinion, you should stay away. So what happens when you find out the recipe wasn't invented by your nonna? It's horrible, isn't it? You become, you know, imagine doing this, and people become very aggressive sometimes. You know, I've seen colleagues being insulted. Huh? Have you heard of the stories about dishes like carbonara? Yeah, yeah. And everybody's, oh, this is the original recipe. No, this is the original recipe. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the kind of thing you need to avoid doing when you're doing this. Don't think about your grandmother. Think about being thorough and being a scholar on this, okay? So, there is another friend you should avoid. I know everybody uses AI these days. I'm not saying, and I don't want to demonize it, but the problem is AI hallucinations are pretty normal. And I was listening to a person who you should read. In fact, you should read his work. His name is Luciano Floridi. He's a philosopher. He was a professor of philosophy at Oxford. Now he's at Yale, where he founded the center, I think, for the study of the ethics of artificial intelligence. He's one of the best minds, I think, in my opinion. And he's written extensively about not just hallucinations, but the fact that, you know, AI, you know, has a lot of limitations as well, no matter how developed it has become. So be careful, because, you know, everybody talks about AI, but at the end of the day, you know, it's not always perfect. Okay. There is another issue here, more precise. AI stops at paywall because of legal and technical requirements. So the information you get may not be correct, because if you can only rely on published evidence, which is actually available without having a paywall. What are you going to do? What if the research has been published and is behind a paywall? You make it up. Who said that? You make it up. You make it up, and you end up in trouble. We'll see in a minute. Okay. So, how are the likes of Google Books? That's a good question. 2 years ago, exactly, I came across an occurrence of Spaghetti House from 1835. I thought, oh dear, that's amazing. I thought. I checked with the EOD editors, with Edmund Weiner, whom we know very well, and he's been working on the EOD, but for the EOD since 1976, 77. And he's a brilliant mind. He checked it. He said, well, no, because Google Books snippets can be wrongly dated. So be careful here, because you may think, oh, I got something new. I'm going to write to the EOD that he got it wrong, and I know everything, because Google tells me that this is actually true. Be careful. How did Edmund know that the typeface, that the information was not actually correct? The typeface character in Spaghetti House looked too modern, as did the style of the writing. So linguists come into play. AI is rubbish from this point of view, because if you studied some old books, and you know there are certain times, like 1820s, you know, they changed typeface or whatever, in the 19th century, 18th century, there are different typefaces. You know that you had to be very careful. And this, at the moment, is not possible through AI. Are you with me? Because of hallucinations. Yeah? So it may be that in 10 years' time, AI may be so, you know, much better than now. It may recognize this, but still you have to be very careful. And So if you're familiar with typefaces, in other words, if you start reading a lot of old books rather than just, modern editions, so that's what you may have done during your BA, am I right? You did a lot of things, So have a look at the older books, and you can straight away notice if something is actually incorrect. Okay. So there's another thing to be said here. Then we can take a break if you want. Famous quotes can be fake. This is the most difficult one, I think, to deal with, because any quote can be true, any quote can be fake. We don't know. How do we know? Well, exactly. This is where it gets very difficult. And I've spent a lot of time doing working on this. Let me start from the first one. Coffee in England always tastes like a chemistry experiment. You can look it up. You find it, and it tells you it comes from a work by Agatha Christie called Black Coffee. Then you're just trying to find black coffee. You find out that's the first. Actually, it wasn't published as a book. It was published as a play. But in fact, the play cannot be purchased. Well, it can be purchased, but it's quite expensive to be performed. But in fact, after this play was written, it was published by Charles Osborne in the form of a novel. It's complicated. Anyway, I read this book. I spent a lot of time because I had to write this article about coffee houses. So I read it through, and I couldn't find this quote. I wasn't happy about it. So I went to see my librarian. And I said, Ian, can you help me? So that's interesting. And then he actually had a book in his pocket because I didn't know he loved Agatha Christie books. And through his resources, he helped me find the e-version of this. So we double-checked that text, and it wasn't there in Black Coffee. Yet AI tells you that it comes from that book, which is not a book originally. It's a play, it's complicated, and it's not there anyway. So what do you do in this case? Well, there are two ways of looking at this. Either you just ignore it, but if you really love it, why don't you say something like, stando a una frase attribuita, or according to sources, okay? And then, maybe in German what you can do, perhaps you can help us what you can do. But try and avoid saying Agatha Christie's famous quote, and that is not correct. You end up like The Guardian doing that PhD nonsense. Are you with me? Would you be happy to write something like that and then people calling you and say, hang on a second, your article is rubbish. Bye-bye. Imagine doing this. Would you feel happy about this? So it's time-consuming, I agree, but that's exactly, I always compare my job to winemaking as opposed to to beer brewing. Beer has to be served fresh. Wine may take time. Okay, sorry for people who don't drink. Okay, so it's the case. So we go back to here. And then, of course, people like it because they say, yes, of course, coffee is bad. Talking about which, there's another myth which I wanted to add now, for me. People talk about, the fact that in England, coffee, there's no culture of coffee. That's complete nonsense. And that's what I'm going to do next month, to write about the fact that the first coffee houses in Western Europe, so outside of what is now Turkey, okay, put it that way, were opened in England, London and Oxford. They're still debating which one was the two. And they became very popular in England before they came to Paris. They changed. And they became cafes, hence the word cafe, which came back into English, was the place where you also have food. So you can write a lot of stories in, story upon story within a story, if I may say that. Okay? Are you with me? And it becomes exciting. But again, you have to keep an eye on science here. And not say, oh, no, in England, people don't drink coffee. Coffee is rubbish because they have tea. Because remember that tea in England came much later. Well, it came at the same time as coffee. But it was actually men accessed coffee, women didn't, and coffee houses were only for men. And tea was only, it was for women, and it was actually drank at home. And it was only because one company collapsed in the 19th century that tea did eventually become the English, so if you want the English drink, okay, because of the East India Company. So before you think it's culture, and you use the word culture, and you throw it in because it's cool, okay, don't do it. Be critical. Start digging. Just because everybody says it doesn't mean it's true. You see what I mean? And this is exactly, it's not, you may become, as I say, antipatical to most people when you do this. I know, people hate me for this. You're a pain in the backside. No, but that's exactly what your job is all about. Imagine going to a doctor who's not precise. They're going to kill you. So I had the same principle I learned. to be precise in this, because otherwise you start just passing on, a lot of nonsense. And obviously, clearly, then in England, tea became very popular and so forth. But think about tea rooms that did not exist until the 19th century, for example. Okay, but you may expect that tea rooms were very popular before that time. They weren't. Okay, so that's an example I want to show you on this. So there's another thing I want to show another example here. Shall we take a break in 15 minutes, or shall we just carry on until the end? What would you want to do? Are you bored to death? Yes, with me, my voice is boring. Anyway, now let's have a look at this. This is exactly, I need to go to the right page. Forgotten the page now. Sorry about that. 18. See, my memory is really bad. Okay, they had to page 18 on this. Sorry, unfortunately, it's no other way of doing it. Can you help me read the pages? Is it 12? Oh, this is the one, sorry. Okay, so I wrote this a while ago. So what I did is, there was something from Italo Calvino. Is anybody familiar with Italo Calvino? Because obviously you become a different generation, I suppose. Some of you may have never heard of Italo Calvino, who is a novelist. Okay. Anyway, and don't look at the picture, please. It's absolute rubbish. Anyway, I wrote, stand up. Is anybody here who's not an Italian speaker here? Is anybody who's not? You're not an Italian speaker, okay, it's fine. So, stando una frase, so according to, this is a quote attributed to Italo Calvino. So, you notice straight away that I go for I don't say, Italo Calvino wrote this, which is the you're tempted to do that, and you say, oh, great, brilliant, you read everything. No, I don't. I look for, when I did this here, I spent a lot of time looking for anything to do with butter. So I looked for any kind of proverb, anything with butter. And I kept looking, until I ended up reading this. And I thought, that's interesting. Because I was asked to write an article, a bizarre article. I was told, is it true, this is the publisher asking me, Gabriele, is it true that you can tell a person's personality, somebody's personality from the way they butter the bread? And I thought, I have no idea. I said, this is nonsense. Okay, so I look into it and I found the published research. I noticed it was actually a big company trying to sell a lot of nonsense. Fine. But then I started thinking about, how about writing about, butter and bread and butter, put it that way. But I don't want to talk about the rest of the article. I started yesterday mentioning the mirror reading. You remember that? So I started here with la fantasia il burro, so imagination is butter. But in order to make it productive, you need to actually spread it on some bread or slice of bread. Okay, so it's an interesting process. So you have to start doing that. So you take something from literature and you start building the story. But by the way, you attach this at the end. You don't start with that. Okay, that was just information. I started from something else, and this is the finishing thing. You start from here, and then I went on at the end. Oops, sorry, it's the wrong page. Sorry. I got lost because of the I speak. Oh dear, whereabouts is it? Oops, hang on. I think it's because of this. Yeah, sorry about that. Oh dear, without glasses, proper glasses, a struggle. Okay, so yeah, I see here. Okay, so here, you see, towards the end, okay, it says. Non si sa se Italo Calvino abbia paragonato il burro alla fantasia pensando alla cucina inglese. So we don't know whether Italo Calvino compares butter to imagination, thinking about English food. Okay, so you can see I mentioned it, but I did not rewrite entirely the quote because it becomes very boring. Had I done this for radio, it would have been very different. I would have repeated the quote because by the time you get to the end, after 4 minutes, you completely forgot. You've forgotten about the beginning. Are you with me? But in a written text, it's best to paraphrase sometimes. Okay. But again, this is to finish it off, and then you can see. Okay. Does it make any sense? A little bit how I built this, but to go back to the original point, which is not about the technique here. It's oh dear. Where are we? Yeah, sorry, I got into a mess now. Here we go. So here. So I wrote stando a una frase attribuita. So according to a quote attributed to somebody, Okay, so that ensures you do not write something which is factually correct. At the same time, it preserves, if you want, the beauty of your text or what you think is actually nice and interesting to tell. But you avoid, if you remember what we did yesterday, chiaramente si è ispirato. J.K. Rowling clearly, drew from, what was it? I don't remember, what was it? I don't remember. It was actually Virginia Woolf, I think, which is complete nonsense. Also because J.K. Rowling gave an interview where she said that her Hogwarts was inspired by Kew Gardens. So it's nothing to do with Virginia Woolf. Just to cut a long story short here. Okay, so just show you exactly how careful you should be when you write on this. So I heard something here. Perhaps I may have written something wrong. If you write it in Italian, try and do something like use the condizionale di dissociazione. In English, you can write according to sources. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. In German, is it country pies you use? Dr. Giulio, perhaps you're not. Don't know. Is it when you report in the statements by other people? Okay. Indirect speech implies you are neutral and not verifying the statement. In other words, you're trying to dissociate yourself from what you've written. Okay, because you've said he said this and it's not true. That's completely different from according to sources. Yeah, are you with me? And you've noticed, Trant, I had to be very blunt. Often, this is the case of Italian journalism compared with Swiss Italian journalism. Italian journalism, sensationalism, straight away, X person killed Y, okay, whatever. And then you find out that it's not true. And this is not good, okay? So this is an example. So in all cases, use caution. Ethical considerations are important here. Now, you can be sued if they're not actually true. Okay, first thing. You may lose your job. Your reputation is at stake. So remember all of this. When in doubt, don't write anything. Well, this is the best advice, But the best thing to do is just don't say, "Oh, I'm not going to write anything," because you're not writing, a PhD. You're not writing about rocket science. You're not writing a paper about, how to end the war in Iran. You're just trying to actually tell a story at the end of the day. So honesty is essential. Don't copy from other people. This is one of the biggest problems. I know some people disagree here, but Umberto Eco, unfortunately, in his Come scrivere una tesi di laurea, which was badly translated to English as How to Write a Thesis, because in the English-speaking world, the tesi laurea is called a dissertation and is very different. So translating How to Write a Thesis sounds like you're actually writing a PhD, and it's not exactly the same thing. In any case, there's a passage, I have to say, I read the English version of this, and there's a passage where Eco explicitly praised plagiarism. And whether he was joking or not, I don't know. It was written there. So be careful, because even if somebody famous wrote it, doesn't mean it's good. Okay. And I know there is a philosopher in Italy who did the same thing. And actually, he plagiarized an entire book, and he got away with murder for an American scientist. So it's not plagiarism as a no-go area, no matter whether you like people or not. Okay. So we go to good practice and best practice. We often hear this in business and Wikipedia, I apologize, LinkedIn, and you think, what on earth is it? I know it's difficult, but I'm going to give you some examples. I think if you want to learn to write, I think one good source is the conversation. I think I'm not referring to the content of the conversation, because every article is different, but it's the style which is interesting. They say academic rigor and journalistic flair. This is exactly what you have to try and do when you write. Okay. Now, let me have an example, and I'm going to show you the article here. Can you see this here? The rule attributed to St. Benedict was set down in 73 chapters. Now, if you look on Wikipedia, it says the following. It says, I've just jotted it down, the rule of St. Benedict. Can you see the difference? The question is, did St. Benedict actually write these 73 chapters? Can you see the difference? Can you spot the difference? It's absolutely massive. So the fact that Wikipedia, and I'll say just Wikipedia, but encyclopedias report this stuff as St. Benedict, rule of St. Benedict, it doesn't mean it's actually true. So this is a specialist, so Professor Gasper, Professor in High Medieval History at Durham University. And what is interesting is the article is very interesting to read, in fact, but it's written so that everybody can read it. We go back to the original example yesterday of the Bible. Remember the preface to the authorized version 1611? Clarity is everything. Don't use words that nobody understands, okay? Because at the end of the day, it's about you. Showing off is useless. Because if people don't understand you, they will switch off. And you can see here, okay, so you can read this article by yourself. And by the way, this is all free, okay? So you can read exciting stuff here. Have you ever accessed the conversation at all? Has anybody tried? Yeah, have you? Yeah, have you found anything interesting? Or? Yeah, I think this is a good example. I'm not saying it's the most beautiful prose in the world. No, this is not, possible. But it's about that style you should try to, I wouldn't say imitate, but to have a look at this style and think about why, for example, in this case, Professor Gasper wrote the rule attributed to St. I'm no expert, so I trust him more than I trust somebody writing in Wikipedia, straight away writing something just because everybody said so. Are you with me? And they end up with it's a fake. Okay. So rigor, accuracy, and flair. We move on to the next bit. So rigor isn't about opinions, right? Versus left wing, but how you treat your sources. First of all, critically. I mentioned earlier on, if you are biased by the topic, don't write. If you have to think about your grandmother's recipe and you think, oh, Granny's recipe, la ricetta della nonna, okay, don't do it. Because if your heart starts beating, the blood doesn't go up here. It doesn't go up here, and you don't think, carefully. So accuracy is not about spelling, but truthfulness. This is the most important thing. Flair isn't about copying somebody else's way of writing, which you wait. They keep saying, oh, if you read more, you become a better writer. I disagree with that, and I'll say why. Because the more you write, the better you get. How do I say this? Because I look at, we all, well, I don't go to the gym, but I work out in different ways. You all work out. And when I play with my children, for example, I tend to use my left foot. I don't play football, but when I play with left foot and I use my left arm, I say, why, if I'm right-handed? Because I want to keep that part of the body trained. So, what has it got to do with writing? Writing is about training. There's nothing basically natural to see in a minute about writing. Although people say, oh yes, the more you read, better you write. No, I'm afraid to say. Okay, it's like the more football you watch, and the better you play. It's complete nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. It's not that you may become an expert in debating, or talking about football, but not necessarily about becoming a better player or a better manager. How am I writer's block? When I was doing my PhD, I had a lot of my fellow students were discussing this. And I said, stop talking, get on with the job. And this is what I learned from one of my supervisors at the beginning. He said, write something every day, as much as you actually work out every day. Don't do it once a week, every day. Okay? And you start writing even a couple of sentences. You don't need to write much. But keep doing it all the time. And rewrite what you just written. Don't think that has to become from the very first moment you've got, like Mozart, you start here, you finish there, and you are just creating a fantastic symphony. I'm afraid there are some people who can do that, but it's very difficult. So if you write regularly, you don't have any blocks here, okay? So I keep saying to my students, this is not for the recording, but if you keep complaining about your figure, and you don't work out, stop looking in the mirror, okay? Keep working out, okay? So, writing is like physical exercise, and reading a lot doesn't turn you into a writer, necessarily. Develop your own style. Now, writing back, I apologize for the quality, but unfortunately, I tried with some help, including the person who's here, but I completely forgot where it came from originally. I think it's from Repubblica. I don't remember who wrote this, and unfortunately, my screenshot is rubbish. When I help you with this, there was molti idraulici for people who don't speak Italian, several plumbers. But look at this. Ci servono molti idraulici, lavoro ben pagato. Can you see straight away? We know that plumbers are well paid. But here it says lavoro ben pagato. So you notice straight away how bad the Italian is. And if you get 20,000 euros a month to write this nonsense, well, you shouldn't do this job, I'm afraid. There is a problem here. The second problem, l'avanzata dell'intelligenza artificiale. You can tell this is actually a translation, so it's even worse, from an original interview to Nigel Farage, okay, who notoriously doesn't speak very well. He speaks very posh, but what he says is not necessarily good in the sense of, he doesn't explain things very well. So what you should do in this case, rather than just translate it, which is also bad because you're showing no originality here. You might have the author may have translated this from Guardian, from the FT, we don't know. The point I'm trying to make is paraphrase it, and you don't end up with this mess in the language, which is really awful. So l'avanzata dell'intelligenza artificiale doesn't mean very much. You can say lo sviluppo, the development. This sounds like an army advancing here. Are you with me? So it's a poor choice for somebody doing this.
You wanted
As
to
a
The author
military
is the author.
image.
This is an interview. This is an interview with Nigel Farage. So this is the original word from Nigel Farage. Okay. The problem is here, and you can see here, this is very bad in Italian, and this is exactly the point I'm trying to
It's
make.
been translated into Italian.
Yeah. What you should do in this case, rather than have a very poor translation, why don't you paraphrase it?
Well, that's a poor translation.
Maybe in the original one, he said the advancement of artificial intelligence.
I don't know, but again, we don't know because I couldn't
Which
find it.
may tell why the journalist translated, because maybe the journalist does not have a base in translation and doesn't know that
It could be. That's a good
advancement
point. That's a good point, yeah.
is a false phrase in Italian.
And you can see it's look poor. The whole point I'm making is not criticizing whoever said this, but if you start from a poor source and then you translate it poorly, and then you actually eventually publish it and it's actually poor again, it's not a good job, is it? So if you paraphrase it, you don't lose the meaning, but you avoid the embarrassment of doing this. Okay, but this is an example. I can actually find you lots of other sources like this. And we're not talking about typos here. We're talking about, text with a put together, very, well, I'd rather not say how. Anyway, now, what about you? Which is why your comment is very, very important to me, because a background in languages and linguistics, these days people are saying, oh yeah, you're doing languages. What are you doing for a living? Yes, I deal with languages. Yes, okay, so you don't work then, do you? So this is exactly the first thing people say, when you say, what do you do? And when I meet people coming from Tesco, delivering I've got a couple of people I know very well, some of my former students as well, and some people look at me and say, poor thing, you have no strength in your body, you can't lift this crate, and you haven't got a proper job. Because what you do, you teach a language. You can see their faces, they just wonder, who's learning Italian, one person asked me here. Who's learning Italian in England? Nobody knows it, learns in Italian. And he was right in many ways. But again, it's not just about translation, as you know, languages. So it's about recognizing, for example, that the text is poor. Imagine a business graduate. I teach a lot of business students. You cannot believe how they write. You will see in a minute some examples, not from my students, but how bad some text can be. Okay, and some emails, I cannot publish them, obviously, I cannot show them to you today, but they're so bad, you start thinking, is this person having an argument with me? Because they can't write. They can't speak either, but they're very good at adding up. So that's why they get the jobs. Yeah? Are you with me? But you have brain. So, yeah, okay, Gabriele, it's fine, but how can I start writing? Well, rem tene, verba sequentur. Yeah? Grasp the subject, words will follow. Yes, it's true. You read and then create, put it that way. Practical tip, first write a draft, focusing on the content rather than the form. So the last thing you should do at the end is to use any tools you want to find, whether you use the word like 3 times, 4 times, 10 times, and you start replacing that. But don't start saying, oh, I've just repeated this word. Don't do it. Leave it at the end. Remember, if you have to write an article, which is 2,200 characters per page, and it has to be exactly 2,200 characters, no more than less than that, the last thing you want to do is keep changing, keep editing whilst you're still thinking. You do it at the end, and at the end, you should be pleased by your work. Okay? So, try and write every day. Yeah? As much as you want it. And understand what you write. So, how you do it? If you're just reading off the screen, it doesn't work. I know it's a pain to print something out. When you print things out, you find typos, and you also notice that you use that word too many times. Okay? And I think read out rather than just read. Okay? Read out loud. Suddenly you find a word that says, "Did I really write this?" And you're ashamed of that. And you start just redrafting that. So that you start again and you do it again. Okay, I learned this when I was doing my PhD. You can read certain things. So it's a tip I learned as well. So it's not me telling you what to do. I learned it, and other people learned it from other people. I think it's good practice that way. Okay, now we get to a very interesting topic. I had an issue years ago, and luckily I got away with it. And it's to do with the myth of the native speaker. You start thinking, is my language good enough? Yes, it is. So when you need help, and you really need help, ask a qualified linguist, especially one with a solid academic background, not somebody who, I taught, this language for 3 months when I was at university. That's all I got. Fine. Well, I got a degree, but then I didn't use it. There's no point in that. Okay. Don't listen to people who describe themselves as native speakers, because native speakerism is a lot of work published on this. It's about identity, not qualifications. So we have to actually remember one thing. One thing is what people declare. They're competent. Have you ever seen people writing on their CVs, English C2? And then you listen to when they actually speak, and they say, oh, God. It's -2, I think. It's now C2. Okay. So it's really, I had somebody recently, a person who works in a quite a famous cultural institute in London, and described himself as a C2 English speaker. I heard an interview on YouTube, and I thought, oh dear. Okay, so that's an example of that. Okay, so we know there are a lot of debates. I don't want to start giving you too many things about this, but there is an interesting book you want to read. This. There are a couple of mistakes to do with, with the some words he used. Thomas Bonfiglio, who is a fantastic scholar, but he wrote about Catholicism in the 13th century, which is obviously smacks of anachronism. But it's a great book to start with, because remember one thing, that what we say now, madrelingua, Muttersprache, native speaker, you name it, they're all categories which are quite relatively recent. The Romans used to describe themselves, to talk about the language as sermo patrios. Nothing to do with mothers, by the way. And apparently, some people say that the first time they started using the idea of the mother here, I don't want to talk about this extensively, but it has to do with Cimabue's work, okay, with the Madonna feeding the baby. And from now on, the idea of the nurturing mother came from, and the idea that you learn from your mother. But again, from a factual point of view, you're right and wrong. Okay, so in a sense, you can learn a language from anybody. Are you with me? Okay, so that's a different story. But if you want to read a lot of the science behind this is a fantastic book to start with, from the invention of the native speaker. So you start thinking about this. Why I'm saying this, because it has got to do with what I had to do 4 years ago. First of all, remember, nobody owns a language. And then people say, oh, my own language. It's like your grandmother's recipe. Now, do you know all the words in the OED? No. When you ask Edmund Weiner, his amazing lexicographer, he edited every single page of the second edition, together with John Simpson, half of the dictionary, 10 volumes each. And he says, don't ask me, I'm just a lexicographer. I don't know all the words of the English language. And then you got the person just finished university and say, oh, crikey, I'm a native speaker, I know everything, call me. Do you prefer to go with Edmund Weiner, who is a humble person, a humble drudge, okay, a lexicographer, or would you like to go for that person qualified from university? This is a question for you. Remember this thing, people who sell you their product are not necessarily experts, okay? Second thing, you can write in any language, really, of course. My German is rubbish. Of course it is rubbish. But when I had to write, I had to actually be precise. So, sorry about that. This has nothing to do with this. Okay, you asked for a better picture of me. I couldn't get it. Oh dear, I'm in trouble now. Yeah. Okay, so this is a funny story because I was asked to write about. This is in Pakistan Zurich paper. For people who were not here yesterday, most people were here yesterday. Is that correct? I told you the story. I went to Zurich, found this the person who owned this PR agency for tourism, and then a few months later, she put me in touch with one of her colleagues, and he offered me the opportunity to write some articles. And then he said to me, "Why don't you write something about products associated to certain cities or certain countries, like Panama hats, Bermudas, you name it, spaghetti alla bolognese, and so forth." And when I got to eventually to the word I wanted to include, because it was actually I loved it because of this story of this word, which was the correct my German, because I'm really I listen to my wife speaking German all the time to me, but I never remember how to say it. Jerusalem artichoke, Jerusalem artichoke, and the guy. Okay, I'm going to call him Jonathan. I'm going to say his surname. And at the Tamida Group, so to do with the publishing, he said to me, "I've never heard this word until I went to England." Okay, and he said, "Trust me, I'm a native speaker." And I just controlled myself. Hang on a second. Let me not have an argument. But before I actually responded to him, first of all, I found an article in the Süddeutsche Zeitung about this. But that's not the point. I found a recording on Swiss German radio, and we're talking about exactly this thing of the Jerusalem artichoke. Okay, so that's that coincidence. And I was tempted to email to him. Then my wife said to me, "Don't do it. Think about the money." Okay, so you had to eat humble pie, as I said yesterday. Yeah, you remember that thing? Ingoiare il rospo. I didn't say anything, and I said, "Hang on a second. Let me keep it for another article in Italian." And by accident, I was asked to write a separate article quickly, and I got extra money. So eventually, my wife's advice was very good. So I got more money, so it was more successful, and I kept that content, obviously for a completely different article, but in Italian. Look, there are people who will tell you all the time that they're right, even if you prove them from the dictionary, from sources, that that word exists, or that expression, that food exists. What are you going to do? I leave it with you, okay? So I sometimes have arguments because this is my job. But when you have to think about money, sometimes, you have to put up with it. Okay, can you follow me on this? Okay, so I did not include that bit of the Jerusalem show here, and I actually left it in another article. Move on here. How about the native writers? Okay, have a look at this. Can you tell me what's wrong with this?
The spelling.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you afterwards. Okay, anybody to help me? Please help me.
The spelling of the word.
Oh yeah, that's terrible. That's terrible. That's terrible. Sorry about that. That's terrorizing the English language. What else?
That it means a syllable.
Well, of course. No, it's more than that.
Sounds like an instrument.
But yes, I thought about the iPhone first of all. And wait for it. We go back to this. According to ChatGPT, a francophone is Deborah Franco making a phone call. Okay, so it's a joke, but think about carefully when, of course, it's a horrible thing to talk about, any Christianophobia, Islamophobia, anything with to do. But think about this, from phone to phone. The point I'm trying to make here is the fact that you grew up in an environment you speak a language doesn't make you turn into a competent person. Okay, look here. The same people, and I don't want to talk politics here, but the same people who say that foreigners should learn English, and they can't write. Can you see that? Tolerance. Now, I looked up the OED, and I haven't found a single form of tolerance written this way, not even 700 years ago. So I'm tolerant, but this is a bit too much, okay? So what I'm trying to say here is there a native writer? Of course there isn't a native writer. Nobody's a native writer, nobody's a native speaker. You're just better trained than others. But one thing is a speaking thing, one thing is a writing thing, and one thing is becoming competent in a certain area. Because if I talk about physics, whether in Italian, English, German, whatever, I wouldn't understand a single iota of that. Okay. So remember that our knowledge is extremely limited. So be humble. Okay. But I know a lot of, because I've been invited to talk to translators and interpreters, and they often describe themselves rather than competence as native, native-like, because it's fashionable. Look, don't do it. Okay, don't do it. Just say you are competent and you're good at your job, and prove it by showing what you can do, rather than waffle. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. How about grammar? This is another big myth. We need it out. So, for hundreds of years, in English at least, grammar referred to the learning of Latin. Of course, grammar has a lot of meanings. Now, this, in fact, it was actually updated a couple of years ago in the OED. But we know that for centuries, the word grammar didn't refer to what I don't know what I don't think about grammar at all. It meant the translation from Latin to the vernacular, hence the expression grammar school in English, which is the place where you learn Latin, but not Latin to speak. Like, I'm working now on a project of spoken Latin with an American guy. He's an amazing guy. And about the spoken language, everything was actually writing and translation, which is why most people can't even say, mi nomine es Gabriele in Latin. Do you know how to say, my name is whatever in Latin? Perhaps you may have done Latin in school, they never taught you. So you can't say you learn Latin. Okay, you only learn to translate. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. So some people use the word grammar and they think about rules. Okay, now, there are conventions. The OED uses always the expression convention because it's a descriptive dictionary. I know a lot of people want to be prescriptive, but the more prescriptive you are, the more you look like a fool, especially if you look at how words developed and the history of language. You become very humble. You start accepting that what you know is extremely limited. And sometimes you may say something stupid. These conventions may vary. Some publishers want you to write it in a certain way. They actually tell you, well, you must put commas here. Well, we'll look in a minute. Now, some educated people say, oh, yes, grammar is about this, and haven't got a clue. Spell checkers sometimes provide factually wrong information about grammar. Why is it so? Because they're not designed by specialists. Okay, and they give you this is wrong and this is right. But look at this. The Romans didn't have any punctuation. And now we write in Latin according to the punctuation that did not exist. So the point I'm trying to make is think carefully before you start judging other people's writing. Because your teacher was very good. Your teacher who finished school at 18, perhaps, taught you this. Be careful, because language is not about rules. It's about conventions. So, use a thesaurus, for example, and free up your mind. Now, writing can be a struggle. There's nothing natural about writing, as you well know, because writing was only introduced a few thousand years ago to record things. Okay, people used to speak for hundreds of thousands of years, and until a century ago, most of the world's population was illiterate. Yet languages existed. That's the point I'm trying to make. Okay, so you don't need the writing in order to speak. Okay, but yes, everybody goes for Duolingo, and what they do is, I had to read and to speak from this text. That's complete nonsense. Okay, so think carefully a little bit. But let's move on to this next bit. No language is better than others. The moment you say this language is better for this, you're passing judgment. Remember one thing, that there was a lot of massive influence from the way they taught Latin, not Latin itself, on English, German, and other languages. Because people were taught to write in a certain way. Let me give you an example in English. They say never end a sentence with a preposition. For example, have you heard of this before? Okay, so a lot of these things, which are based on the way Latin was taught in school. Okay, so remember this. Now, keep your language simple. Can you read this? If you can read it, you're a genius. I want to see somebody falling asleep now. My youngest son, who's 11, said he stopped after the second line. And he has a point. I made this up, by the way, okay? So this is not taken from anybody else. I see you say, what on earth is this? This is awful, isn't it? Yeah. Would you read a text like this? Okay. Yesterday, I was reading a book I can't show you because I don't want to, to put the person into, well, I don't want to actually talk about that person because I don't know this person. And it took me 18 lines between the first word of that paragraph to the last one without actually having to breathe at all. And I thought, for goodness sake, what did he write here? Okay. Give some breathing space. Make your sentences short because the moment you read too much, you forget a lot. You need to breathe. Your brain needs to breathe as much as you need to breathe when you speak. Imagine doing this. Okay. So, did you understand anything here? No. So this is absolutely a horrible example. Okay. People will never pay attention when you write like this. Yes, but this is the way we write in Italian. Who said that? I challenge that. Think about your own style. Develop your own style. The most important thing, is your text nice? Yes. If somebody says, I like the way you write, that's already exactly what you need to do. Not to think, oh gosh, do I write like Don Calvino or Manzoni? Don't listen to those people who tell you to do that. Okay, those are interesting writers, but you shouldn't follow that example because these days, those texts are very difficult. Okay. Now, punctuation, this is an interesting point. Breathe to put and pause. Now, punctuation isn't a religion. Talking about this, I want to show you something. Okay.
Non c'era neanche la grammatica tedesca, per forza doveva inventarsi.
So this is 1530. Sorry. This is 1534. So it's Luther's translation of the Bible. I'm showing you this not because the actual content, but I want to show you something. Let's see if I can see it. Quality is not very good, unfortunately, as I expected. Let's see if I can see it now. Yeah. Sorry, I just need to go a little bit further. Yeah, it's not very easy to. Unfortunately, at home, I could actually see everything. What I wanted to show, unfortunately, the quality isn't that great, is that there are no commas here. But then German has commas everywhere. Now here, you must put a comma here, comma there. Look, yes, and then you start thinking, but, well, Luther then was ignorant. A few years ago, somebody published on Twitter a text by Molière. And a person had no idea it was Molière said, oh, this person can't write in French because Molière didn't put any diacritics. Of course, because it had not been invented yet or they had not been used. So be careful to start judging text because your teacher said this to you and you start thinking, this is exactly what language should look like, okay? Because the development of language is very slow. And remember that punctuators were not teachers. The greatest punctuators were three punctuators. The first one was St. Jerome and the Bible. So because the children could not read Latin very well, they struggled, so they actually started breaking things up. And then you got Alcuin of York, who invented the space between words. That's at Charlemagne, during the reign of Charlemagne in Aachen, in present-day Aachen. Have you been there? Okay, Alcuin was very important. So he introduced what we now see as the space between words. That's a fascinating thing. And then you got a guy called Aldus Manutius, or Aldo Manuzio, who died in 1515. And he was very instrumental because after him, for example, the comma, Caxton used a virgule and not a comma, and after that, the apostrophe after that was introduced and became very fashionable, and start people thinking, oh, the English can't write because they can't put the apostrophes in the right place. When you look at the history of the apostrophe in English, it kept changing for hundreds of years. It became fashionable. So before you judge, keep checking, facts, because otherwise you become extremely intolerant. So next month, you can find this article by Professor Chris Holly. He's going to come. He's going to be we're going to host a talk by him. He's one of the greatest experts on history of punctuation. And you can find the article attached to your webpage sometime. Professor Murphy will give you that link. Read it. It's very short, but it gives you a very interesting view of punctuation. So before somebody says to you, you can't punctuate, like New York Times, that kind of thing, look, tell them to shut up and to read this, okay? Because punctuation isn't a religion, although some people think, I own it, okay? So, remember the Romans didn't have punctuation, but they still have one of the biggest empires in the world. So they're organized. So punctuation isn't about organization, as you may hear on LinkedIn. So, who invented punctuation? I already mentioned that. Now we go back to radio. Sorry if I jump back to that. I mean, we didn't finish. I'm sorry. Have you heard of a program called Just a Minute? I don't think we'll be able to play it here. Have you heard of this program before? This is a fantastic tool. It's a funny program where guests have to speak for 1 minute about anything. They can waffle, really. But there are some rules here, which is to do with no hesitation, no repetition, and no deviation. And then you've got a minute now, you've got blah, 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 blah. You can only, I suppose, repeat the pronouns. There are certain rules. But if you repeat action twice, for example, somebody will stop you, this person will take over, and the person who gets through the minutes gets the point. So why I'm trying to say this? Because this is simple to remember. No hesitation, radio programs, this is typically you start talking. Okay, if it's live programs, it's typical to go on like. Don't do it. Remember that people are listening to you. What is normal in a normal environment may not be acceptable on radio because it shows how poor your language is. So control your breathing, control your words very well. It's not easy. I've also made mistakes when I did live programs. But if you make a mistake, say so. Apologize. Don't say, oh, I need to drink a glass of water. Don't do it. You're telling a lie. Just say, sorry, I've made a mistake. People appreciate that honesty. Okay? So, no repetition. Now, repetition is very good for radio, not for that radio program, by the way, but it's great because by the time you get to the end of the story, people may have forgotten about everything. So it's nice to repeat. So it works very well. So I showed my text, the original radio program, to a colleague in Milan, and he said to me, yes, if you want to get it published, we need to revise this. Yeah, I agree with you. And I said, look, because it was designed for radio, if you had to actually publish as a text, you cannot do this because you have to replace a lot of things. Repetition doesn't work because when people see your text, and they keep seeing the same word repeated, they say this person can't write. Okay, so no deviation. This is difficult. You start from one topic and you just move on, blah 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 blah, blah and you never stop. This is not exactly what you should be doing. So, and you hear a lot of people just waffling on radio, which is why. There aren't many radio stations in Europe that are good, but when you find good ones, I keep mentioning a good example is Clara, is a Flemish radio station. Amazing voices, the most beautiful voices you can get anywhere, Clara. Content as well, very precise, beautiful, okay, spot on. I'm a great fan of that, okay. So, hesitation, repetition, deviation. Try avoid repeating the same words, use synonyms. But the worst is in English and Italian. In Italian, magari, 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 diciamo, 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 magari, 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 magari. How often do you hear this? Often, yeah. And like in English, okay, how many likes do you need to be disliked? This is the question. Okay, so tripping over words may occur. So as mentioned, just apologize. Now, this is dodgy a little bit. If you're reading off a script, use punctuation to breathe. So remember, punctuation is there to help you, not to tell, oh, this is a break, or this is actually because my teacher told me so. Yeah. Change rhythm. Perhaps, you can use a hyphen and you're signaling that you want to take a bigger break. Change rhythm to vary your delivery, for example. When speaking, control your breathing, something I can't do very well because I have some issues. But if you do it by using your diaphragm, for example, your voice will become much, much clearer. Okay. So it's a difficult thing to do, but if you start practicing, you can find videos online how to do it. You will see that your voice will become deeper. I wouldn't say it sounds more attractive, but at least it becomes deeper. You become more relaxed when you speak. So especially because if you've never done any radio programs before, you may be having jitters when you're there, buongiorno, you hear that voice like that. Okay, breathe deeply and it will help you very much. Okay. Remember that the most important thing for speaking isn't words, it's your breathing. Because vocal cords need to be trained. I have a lot of students who only write all the time. They never done presentations at school. When they come to university, they think that you got a throat, you got a mouth, you can speak. No. You need to train by giving talks. Not reading off a script, by the way. That's a different thing. The myth of the native speaker. We need to help a qualified linguist, preferably Amen. That's exactly what happens when you read, and people fall asleep. Okay, so use this to help. Yeah. So remember that treat punctuation not as a grammar rule, but as a tool to help you breathe. That's an essential thing. Okay. Otherwise, you can avoid it, because if I had to write 2,200 characters, Will Self, for example, published a novel 12 years ago, and he said, I had enough of Gutenberg and his friends, and he said, enough of punctuation. James Joyce did the same. They got published. I'm not saying you will get published, but you can give it a go. Are you with me? So before you think you must write this, and the last thing, last but not least, spell checkers don't like last but not least. Every time I write it, they say, use concise language. No, I keep saying use common sense. But as you know, common sense is not so common. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry. Sorry about that. It's like painful, isn't it?
Gabriele, I have a question, because when we look at rhetorical figures, I asked you one yesterday about the same thing. One of the key strategies is repetition, because rhetorical figures, help you to remember things by repeating sound or repeating a structure or something like that. So it's interesting what you say here. How do you put the two together?
That's a difficult question, I'm afraid. For radio...
What is the question? We couldn't hear it.
So the question is,
sorry, you want
when we do rhetoric, one of the key features of rhetorical figures is repetition of different types. Okay, so repetition of sound, repetition of a structure, parallelism, etc. And so the fact that you talk about not repeating, how do you put the two together? Because they're both about performing language.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I had to admit that my problem when I moved from radio to writing radio is writing, by the way. Okay, so what I did for radio is first you write and then you record the stories. But I realized straight away in the beginning that repetition worked very well for radio, because when you do a story, you repeat a name. You don't use a silly thing. Instead of using a pronoun, it can be confusing. Lui, lei. You prefer to repeat the name of the person. But when you write for a magazine, you may use pronouns instead, or you use something slightly different. It's because there is, this is an interesting question, because years ago, there's a friend of mine, Massimo Lardi from Switzerland, he said to me, you see, he was brought up in German-speaking Switzerland. He's an Italian-speaking writer. He said, in German, it is quite acceptable to repeat things in writing. But he said, in Italian, as a man of letters, he said, it's not really good. So my advice to you is, don't do it. And I think it was a good piece of advice from that point of view, which I applied to the book I published after I did my PhD, which I started from English and I had to do it in Italian. So that taught me a lesson a little bit, because there is a perception in readers that if you repeat, when you read the same word, you're running out of ideas. Okay, so it's a perception. It's not about technique here. So if you keep reading the same word in a text, I can assure you that most of you think, interesting article in English way, and that but is the person could write better. So it's not about strategies, because I don't plan anything like that. It's just about, first I write anything, and if I find a lot of repetitions in the writing, I remove them by using a thesaurus all the time. I don't start thinking, I don't use the computer or anything, I use a dictionary all the time. And I try to find a word to replace it.
So it's really lexical repetition
that
you're
lexical, yes.
Suggesting.
Yeah, not an entire, I wouldn't use anything else. I only do for the lexical point of view, Yeah, sorry. In fact, Mandy pointed out an interesting thing, sorry, Professor Murphy, because when you speak, your waves, you measure in kilohertz, the air goes mainly in one direction, which is like this, and it goes like this. So if you are turning here, and you can see there is another room there, you cannot hear anything. And it's exactly what I was talking about yesterday, about the fact that don't blame others for not speaking clearly. Make sure you're sitting in the right position. And when you're recording, must be an obsession, really, to the millimeter. You have to learn everything about that, okay? The position of the mic and that kind of thing. So no, I didn't give a very scientific answer to that, but lexical mainly, I don't think too much about substructures, because I come from, I do it from a working perspective rather than a theory perspective, whereas you do a lot of theory here. Is that correct? And for me, I struggle with that, I have to say. I'm honest with you. Yeah. That's why you need a specialist like Professor Murphy to explain to you how the structure of story works. I did it the hard way, write and learn. But there is another way, which is the way you're learning. Is that correct? But the two things are not at odds. I think you can do, and actually you benefit more because you got the critical viewpoint on writing that I don't have from that point of view. Mine is only informed by factual versus non-factual. Are you with me? Any more questions?
I mean, just quick consideration about personal topics. I try to avoid personal topics. I've always thought about giving a personal touch would enrich your story or whatever, but apparently it's not, as you
No,
explained.
personal touch, yes. But when you start talking about yourself, you expose your, well, you put yourself into a vulnerable position, okay, because everybody knows about you. Is that what you want to achieve? I don't know. Again, it depends on you, but I think there is a risk. And also because if you get emotionally involved and you find out what you say, I mentioned the nonsense recipe, and you end up that that recipe is nonsense, that's going to be devastating.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I thought because a good writer would be able to be objective, even if it's something that concerns himself.
Which is one problem with a lot of people doing PhDs. I notice they write about identity and about themselves. And I keep thinking, for me personally, this is an awful area, because you have to try to detach yourself from that content. I had to write about nationalism. If I had to start writing and taking sides, that would be a complete nightmare. Imagine that. You cannot be objective sometimes. Of course, nobody's objective, but you cannot be objective when you start looking at, for example, I was dealing with people leaving certain areas in Europe because their grandparents were expelled. And if you write as a descendant of these survivors, you typically write, against the people who took over your land. Are you with me? And that's unfortunately is common in that writing. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but again, you're going to have a horrible life, I'm afraid. Sorry, it's going to affect you very badly because your life and your personal interest, your professional life and your personal interest become one thing, and you cannot switch off. So my personal advice: stay away because it can be lethal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, but this is not. I'm not here to advise you what to do, by the way, but to say be careful because. And the most important thing from today is think about not what I've done, but think about how you can prevent problems. So, it's the critical approach to writing. Yeah. One thing you want to learn from today, not from me, but remember the critical approach to your sources. Remember the Vogue, or was it? The one about a PhD, you can destroy a reputation of a university by saying, "Oh, getting a PhD in Milan is very easy." Would it be good for the university? No. Imagine that. There are universities that sell PhDs. I know this. So can you see what I mean by that? Okay. So, any more questions? So you really want to go to the pub, don't you? Oh, I've forgotten to show you something about Prosecco. Yes, I've forgotten about that. Talking about, I don't like Prosecco, by the way. Sorry to say that. I prefer Cremant. Now, so you might think, sorry, we have to do a little story at the end to finish it off. With some bottles of sparkling wine. The fizz is important in your writing. I think the bubbly bits. I think because you had to show a little bit of freshness. So if I may use this comparison with wine, but there are people who, when they write, again, say my grandfather used to make Prosecco. That's not me, by the way. Okay. My grandfather didn't make Prosecco. He bought champagne from France, I think. So I'm joking. So the issue here is, oh yes, I know about this. I produced this, and therefore I'm competent. And then you find out that the story of your product, Prosecco, is a bit different from what they tell you in marketing. So you think Prosecco can only be that type of wine. It's bubbly or semi-sparkling or it's fizzy, depending on the pressure you apply, and that's your image. Or you got distilled variety, as the old distilled variety doesn't exist. See, your knowledge is limited. Then you find out that Prosecco, in fact, is a bit more than that. That until 1821, there was no fizz. It was invented by a Frenchman, and this hurts the Italians who think, oh, Frenchman invented the sparkling variety Prosecco. And then again, if you start thinking with nationalism, instead of thinking scientifically, you end up in hell. Yeah. Okay. And you find out that Prosecco instead meant everything and nothing. In fact, originally, the first recording, it was in English at least. I don't know about it in Italian, but it's not very recent. It was to do with a guy called Frank Morrison. If you want to read some exciting stuff, Frank Morrison wrote a fantastic book, The Itinerary. He traveled around Europe in the 1580s and 90s. He published a book in Latin, translated into English, and he gave us the first occurrence of Prosecco and the first occurrence of public house. But the first occurrence of public house wasn't in England, was in Leipzig. So you see the surprises? Okay, so it's interesting. But what is interesting in Prosecco, and I will talk about this on the 30th of July, if you came to Switzerland, I'm going to talk about this, and it's going to be tasting as well of Prošek. Prošek is a sweet wine from Croatia, and it's very expensive and it's very good. I'm not encouraging to drink it, but think about carefully. The Italian producers have started a war because they completely ignore the linguistic and historical evidence behind this, which is Prosecco is a modern invention, but it's been there for hundreds of years and people use it for completely different wines. Yes, but this is marketing. I get it. But you are wrong to say this. You are the owner of this word. And this is exactly what I'm trying to say, because the word meant several things during different periods. And in fact, today we only mean one thing because we got the PDO, so the legal part. It doesn't mean that you cannot apply to the rest. But to prohibit the sale of a certain wine because you think you know it all, you show what happens in business. I'm not going against the Prosecco producers, but I want to make you think. You may work in business one day. You may tell them, hang on a second, can you be just a little bit more humble and understand that, the same happens for Tokai, used to be made in Alsace for hundreds of years, or in what is now Friuli. And then suddenly you can no longer make Tokai outside Hungary. Can you think of this? That shows you the ignorance that you may help these people to contribute to make them think a little bit before they actually say, we own this word. Are you with me? As linguists, this is exactly what you can do. Sorry if I mentioned this at the end, but I want to make you think a little bit, okay? Because it shows you, how this product, moved on. And in 1617, certainly Prosecco was sweet wine, because in those days, wine was typically sweet. Whether you like it or not, that's the way it is. Which is why, you can look at John Dickey's programs about the history of food. When he goes to Naples, he tries to ask local Neapolitans, say, this is actually Neapolitan food from the 15th century. People say, I hate it. This is not our food. Are you with me? But this is science. And science sometimes hurts. Sorry to say that. And sometimes you may have arguments, this is point, in the name of science. So are you ready for that? You don't want to end up like Giordano Bruno, being burned at the stake. You want like Galileo, but imagine those cases. You want to be like them in the sense that you want to show that you can do science, and you can actually contribute in a scientific and a scholarly way to improving, for example, storytelling in business. So we got a gentleman here who's a successful business person who studied languages here. He knows a lot of things about this. Another time he can tell you a story. I'm finished. I apologize for that.
Well, actually, Gabriele, I live in Bologna, so every year we have thousands and thousands of tourists swarming into the city and longing to eat, guess what? Spaghetti bolognese.
Okay, you have to invite Luca Cesari, who's a friend of mine, to talk about this when he comes back from England. Okay, he's in England at the moment.
Yeah. So what you're teaching here is to have respect for words, for the truth, etc. And I have a personal friend who owns a restaurant, and every time somebody comes in and says, do you have spaghetti bolognese, or spaghetti bolognese, as they normally say, he sees them out of his door and say, you see that restaurant down there? You will eat that shit down there, okay? So please get out of my restaurant. But up until 10 years ago, everybody was trying to explain this to tourists. This was a non-real thing. So this was not existing in the real life of the Bolognese people. But like 7-8 years ago, many restaurants in the city center of Bologna, you can go visit them personally, have spaghetti bolognese on their menu. Why? Because the people expect to see it, expect to eat it, and they give them what they want. So I know spaghetti bolognese does not exist. And we have to be loyal to truth and truly loyal to the meaning of words. But ignorance is the soul of business.
That's a good one to finish off.
Wow.
We
That's the
started
one
from
line.
ignorance, we're not with ignorance.
Ignorance is the soul of business. That's an amazing
Lesson
statement.
must go.
That's a good
I love it. I can't come to Milan for the next one, but it'd be great.
I'd like to thank Gabriele, because one of the things that I think you all need to see is where people end up. All right, this guy studied languages, he did English and German, and he's doing something out of passion. All right, but which takes you so much.
The word passion, by the way, I've forgotten to say it. I always say never take it, because passion is from patio, to suffer. The passion of Christ. I don't want to be end up with the cross.
The word I wanted to underline was quality. He didn't use that word, but basically by showing how he goes to all the sources, that you don't want to write rubbish, or you don't want to write the first thing that comes into your mind. The secret to what you're saying, I think, is taking something seriously and wanting a quality product at the end of the day. All right, which is maybe not what they need in business, but certainly if you're going to be a writer, you want to make sure that what you write is worth reading. So thank you very much.
Stop.